if I could then hand over to you, Simon. Thank you very much.
Here we are, and good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome from me. And I am very, very pleased to be back in Asia, even if it's just virtually. It's a part of the world that I miss very, very much. So without further ado, because we've got a lot to get through, I will cut the inane chatter and go straight into what we are going to be talking about today. And today we're thinking about planning for learning, lesson planning. And as usual, I like to try and just set out a little bit of a way of starting. So firstly, I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you will have a bit of a clearer idea about what I mean by planning for learning. Thinking about using live planning, I'm sure many of you do already. Think about some of the dynamics behind planning, and just a very quick peek into some of the Cambridge University Press resources to show you how this can, or they can, support you. Now, for this session, I'm trying to keep it as interactive as possible. And to that end, I want to introduce you to my RAG. And RAG is red, amber, green. It's my traffic light. And I've got 3 little cards. Now you can make cards like this for your learners. A red card, and a red card really means I don't understand something. Please, can you tell me another way? Now I've used those words very particularly because this is my learner-centered approach. And the learner-centered approach says, I actually want to do the work. It's not I'm giving up, but I need to understand it a bit more. Amber means that I just need to think about it a little bit. And if we show the green, it means I really do understand it. Now, we have to be careful saying green, because if we do this with our children, they will always show us green because they want to please. So challenge them on it and ask them to tell someone else, because the highest level of learning, and we're coming back to that word learning, is to be able to share your knowledge, to be able to tell someone else. So throughout today, whenever you see that traffic light symbol, that is for you to give me feedback. I am doing an assessment of your learning, an instant assessment. And that instant assessment will determine what I do next. So if you are very clear on that, if you understand that it's red, I don't understand, tell me another way. Amber, I need to think about it. Green, I get it. Please type now into the chat R, A, or G. And it looks like we've got lots and lots of G's, and I hope you've been familiar with this, and that means we can get going. So this is a way of managing it, and you can put this into your class immediately, whether you are teaching online, whether you are teaching in hybrid, whether you are back in school, it still works. So let's move on and use that. And by the way, this assessment for learning is absolutely a key constituent of planning for learning. So let me ask you a very quick question now, and you can, again, you can give me a response, but where are you now? Do you have to write a detailed lesson plan for all of your lessons and submit it to your senior leadership team? So do you have to do that at the moment? So just again, just type in a yes or a no. Are you expected to do a detailed lesson plan? And a lot of people saying yes, yes, yes. And then linked to that, do you get feedback on those lessons? And often there, but the key thing is, do your lessons follow your lesson plan? Do they always follow your lesson plan? And I'm looking at that now, and we're getting a lovely mixture of yes and no. Interesting, interesting. Not always, not all the time. And that's exactly what we think. And that's why I want to focus. Let me share with you what we do currently in England. Now, this may not be relevant to you, but in England, we have moved on from writing detailed lesson plans. And I'll read this because it says quite clearly, creating detailed lesson plans can become a box ticking exercise. And that box ticking exercise is usually in the senior leadership team. Ah, right, teacher's written a lesson plan, tick, done. And it creates an unnecessary workload for teachers. So think, how much time do you spend writing a lesson plan and then you don't follow it? Or you don't get feedback? Or as someone just said there, their senior leadership team is so disorganized they don't know what they're actually writing about, or whether they give feedback, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And I like this last bit, taking time away from the real business of planning. And that is the key. It's the real business of planning for learning. And some teachers, yeah, false comfort of purpose. That means, oh, I'm doing something. And so often we get this idea that if you could write a good lesson plan, you're a good teacher. I beg to differ. So let's not. And the reasons for this are quite simple. Learning doesn't follow a plan. Learning is dynamic. Learning is ongoing. Learning happens. You've heard about these ideas of the light bulb moment. Wow, suddenly it happens. And it doesn't matter how carefully you have planned. Learning doesn't always follow that plan. So therefore, it's very clear to me that you might write the most incredibly detailed lesson plan and you have thought about everything. Ah, Sandra's come up there. We teach the learners and not the plan. And I'm getting to that very, very much. Because it is, yes, but you do need a plan, which is what I agree. Static lesson plans might be approved, but a quality lesson, and this is what we're talking about, a quality lesson is formative in nature, and it has to respond to your learning needs. So if you're doing a really good one, then you need to be able to change. And as someone has just said, and I think it's absolutely critical, and it's something that is utterly passionate for me, is it's not what you teach, it's who you teach. And this has got to underpin our planning for learning. Now, we know that most schools still expect some static lesson plans. Even good schools, even top schools still expect it. We know management use them for record keeping. We know that they use them to evaluate their teachers. I've been into schools where quite simply, and I was a teacher in a school where the quality of my lesson plan was the quality of my teaching, and they don't necessarily link. So let's think, does a good lesson plan mean good learning or good outcomes? We have to think about that. But the plan, as Sandra said, the plan is still important, and I'm getting to that. It's what we actually do. And there's a big difference to me between writing a lesson plan and planning for learning. There is a big difference. Writing a lesson plan is not the same as planning for learning. And we'll follow this through now. So what should there be? Well, quite simply, we should be looking at school level. The planning happens at school level, and that is our curriculum. That's what we are going to be delivering. Now, our curriculum is also the experience of the learners and teachers, the experienced curriculum. It's everything, okay? It's not just what we are actually going to do in class. The medium-term plan, that's a bit more detailed. Now that is, what resources are we going to use to deliver that learning? And that should be at department level, fitted in with the curriculum. What should they be? What textbooks are we going to use? What ideas are we going to generate in that? And that should be collaborative. The department should be sitting down together to work that out. And then finally, the teacher level, that's where our plan for learning is individualized. And the reason for that being individualized is each of us as teachers, we are unique. We have our own way of interacting with our learners in our classes. And therefore teaching becomes personal, because although I said it's not what you teach, it's who you teach, focus on our learners, a learner-centered approach is also personalized. We approach things differently. Very quickly, in Cambridge, full support. So there's schemes of work that you can do all of the levels of planning. So what would I like experienced teachers to do? Well, the most important thing is, and Joe says at my school, they expect teachers to create the curriculum every semester. Shouldn't happen. It should be at school level. You should know. You should be working from your scheme of work. So Joe, everyone can help from Cambridge. You can get there. So develop live plans for learning over a sequence of lessons. So live plans mean it's a dynamic document focused on learning intentions, thinking about the language levels of our students. Are we connecting? Can they express themselves? Are they able to distinguish between the question from a language or a content point of view? Are they seated in the most effective way? Or do, when we go into a classroom, do we just accept that that's where they're sitting? Or do we change it to meet our learning needs? And most importantly, are we doing continuous formative assessment? So I strongly recommend that we plan for learning, okay? We don't have to have a very detailed lesson plan, especially experienced teachers. You think about the whole sequence of lessons. You plan live. That means when you do an assessment for learning, if you need to change what's going to happen in your lesson, you must do it, but make a note of it. Keep that document alive so that you've got that evidence. If your senior leadership team come to you and say, why aren't you following your lesson plan? You can say, because I asked a question they clearly didn't understand, so I had to take a step back, and here is the evidence of it in my plan. So we have to know them, and you have to know your learners. So if that idea is clear, please let me know. Very quickly, red, amber, green. Does my approach to that make sense to you? Excellent, excellent, excellent. Yes, lots of nice things. Good, good, good. Brilliant. So let's see, what do we mean by planning for learning? Well, as we've said, a planning for learning. What is learning? Is learning the same as doing? What do we mean by learning? Well, what I mean by learning is not memorizing content. Learning is not memorizing content. You can't, I know we talk about let's learn something off by heart. Can you repeat it? That's not learning. Learning is the ability to apply your knowledge in a new situation. It's the application of knowledge. So as a consequence, that can change. The more knowledge you have, the more you can change it, the more you can apply it. So I talk about a learning cycle, and this influences the way that we teach and the way that we plan in school. Always starts with planning. Planning is critical. Don't stop planning. It's the way that you plan. That is clear. So you plan, what are we going to learn? Our learning intention. We plan our success criteria. How do we know they are learning? Then we think about the learning activity. What are we going to do to drive that learning? Then we think about the feedback. What feedback do we give? What feedback do they give? That is where these come in. As we're working, we are getting feedback. That means we need to change and think about what we do. We must build in time for improvement. This is our learning cycle because it influences the planning. It's live. It keeps going. It changes. It's dynamic. In Cambridge, we do the same thing, but we've done a lot of the hard work for you. We've given the learning intentions, the success criteria. We've talked about the language support that you might need to introduce a new topic. We've given starter activities, main activities. We've given suggestions about assessment for learning, differentiation. What you've got to do is adapt it to your particular situation. And that's the other key, flexibility. You need to be able to adapt. Thinking about it all the time. You are focused on who you are teaching, not what you're teaching, who. How are they responding? Don't worry about, oh, I've got to tick this, or I've got to do this, I've got to say that. What happens if they're not listening? If your students aren't responding, who are you teaching? That's what you've got to plan for. So a learning intention. I've talked about a learning intention. Now, a learning intention is very, very clear. And the word intention is used very deliberately because it puts an emphasis on the process of learning, not just the end product. Memorizing is the end product. Can you repeat something? You can memorize something and you have no idea what it means. You've lost that understanding. It doesn't mean anything. So a learning intention thinks about how are we learning? It's focusing on the concept. Do we actually understand that? Can we apply that knowledge? New skills, okay? Transferable skills. It moves from one place to the other. So we think about what do we want our learners to know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a series of lessons. We plan over a series of lessons. Now, to make this a bit clearer, here are some examples. I could ask you, write a ghost story. That's a doing activity. That's what we're going to do. We're going to write a ghost story. But what we're actually learning is how to use a story mountain. That's building up to a climax and then a resolution. That's what we're learning. Painting a sunset is blending colors. An enrich activity called one big triangle. If you're a maths teacher, what you're actually doing is you're playing a fantastic game. It's a brilliant game. But what the learners are doing is they're developing their strategies of number pairs to 10. It's for little children. But I do it with grown-ups and teachers, and they still can't get it all the time. It takes them a long time. It's a brilliant activity. For a scientist, mixing salt and flour in water, recording what happens. That's what we're doing. But what's the point of doing that? Well, what we are learning is the difference between a solution and a mixture. Okay, and how we can tell the difference. So that's a learning intention. And Thomas says students here can repeat lots of English, but understand hardly any of it. Exactly. And that's my whole point. They've memorized chunks of language, but they have no idea what it means because we just focus on memorizing, not on actually using it. And when I talk a lot about language use, I talk extensively about the idea that our students must use the language. We talk about this, I won't talk about that now. That's my language topic. Sorry, got sidetracked. So what do we mean by success criteria? And success criteria are the steps to that final learning outcome. It's how we actually get there. And that success criteria, those steps to success, is where your real, if you like, influence can come in, because this is where you can build differentiation. We know where we want to get, but the steps that you take can be differentiated for different groups of learners. And that's where you plan. So some learners might need a bit more support, some might not. So some will take fewer steps or larger steps than others. So this is where we do it. And in Cambridge, what we do is we've described these as can-do statements. So learners can do this, they can do that, and it's progressive. So success criteria are progressive. So in a Cambridge book, here are the learning intentions. This might be a speaking, ask questions. Okay, use of English, use imperative forms. Use of English, use adverbs. Vocabulary, cook, headmistress, etc. This is at primary. So understanding the meaning of language is the main challenge, absolutely. And this is the way that we have to do it, because this is not just language, this is everything. Okay, this is all of it, the concepts, the building of those concepts. Our success criteria will be learners can understand, with support, details of a conversation. Okay, and it's that we've given the basics. The learners can understand something. The learners can express them. So the basis is there. What you need to do as teachers, and this is where the real planning comes in, is you need to adapt what is there for your particular context. You must get to know your learners and you must plan for learning. And you're teaching live people. Okay, so plan. Who are you teaching? Not what are you teaching? Who are you teaching? How are they going to respond? Who works well together? Who doesn't work well? Who's got good language? Who's got poor language? Think about it. That is what it's all about, thinking. So let me know if that makes sense to you. Again, feedback, red, amber, or green. And again, if you've got any comments, and I love the comments coming through in the chat, because it means we can make this slightly more interactive. And if you do have any questions, any longer term questions, please put those in the Q&A for the end. We've got a few minutes left. So when we talk about our planning for learning, we must think about assessment, because this is how we get feedback. And our assessment for learning means we are getting feedback as we are learning. Assessment for learning happens in the lessons. It happens during the lessons. This is based on the work of Dylan William and Paul Black, called Inside the Black Box. And this is a wonderful quote from Paul Black that explains this in perfect everyday language, English language. But you can translate this. When the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. When the customer tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. So Shirley says, we teach humans, therefore we must focus on who we teach. And strangely enough, this isn't really the human, but when the cook tastes the soup. Now, very quickly think, if you've heard this quote before, who is the cook, who is the soup, and who is the customer? If you've got any ideas, just tap them into the chat box there. So when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. So who do you think the cook could be? Well, the cook is most likely to be the teacher, absolutely. The soup is our learners. That means you taste the soup and you say, ooh, it could do with a bit more salt. Let me put a bit more chili in it. Oh yes, I think a bit more onion. So our soup is our learner. As you are making the soup, in other words, as you are teaching your learner, you are constantly testing, tasting, checking the learning. Because when the customer tastes the soup, the customer being the exam board, okay? The customer is the exam board, or the parents, or the school, or the test. The end might be your senior leadership team. Your customer is your exam board, your test. And when the customer tastes the soup is our learner, it's either good or not so good, but the customer doesn't do anything about it. They can just say, no, I don't like that soup, send it back. Cook has not done a good job. That is summative assessment. And a summative assessment comes at the end. So it's at the end. You can't do anything about it. So assessment for learning happens in the lesson. And as a consequence, if you don't make any changes, imagine you don't change. You taste your soup and say, oh, it needs a bit more salt, but I haven't got time to do that. I've got to stick to my lesson plan. In other words, I'm following my recipe, and my recipe says put half a teaspoon of salt in, or 5 grams of salt, and I've tasted it and I say, it needs a bit more salt. Well, if I don't make those changes, I am not doing assessment for learning. So you have to plan for it. You have to think about it and recognize that if you're going to introduce this, changes will need to be made. Do it gently, do it carefully, but make it clear what you're doing. Your learning intentions and success criteria must be clear. And your feedback, your assessment is linked to your learning intentions and success criteria. Don't change the goalposts. Don't move them there. And yes, success criteria are sometimes used by strict targets. Okay, you've got a certain amount of material to do. Complicated forms. That's why you've got to simplify it. You've got to simplify it. And Danny says scaffolding lessons, formative and summative. Absolutely, Danny. Quite agree. This is this flexibility. And if your institution does set strict formats and strict targets, it's because they've had negative experiences with what we call backpack teachers. So teachers just come and go. And that is a good reason for planning for learning. It requires institutional change and it requires trust. So what could we do? Well, I like this idea of an exit ticket or an exit slip. So you come to the end of a lesson and you ask your learners, write down very quickly, what have you learned? What would I like to learn? So at the end of the lesson, it gives you feedback, because remember, you're planning, and Arnold, low fire makes good soup, low fire cooking. Absolutely. Slow and steady. Try not to burn the soup. It's horrible when it's burnt. Okay. And that's what we get in crammers. That's what we get when we burn the soup. We push and push and push and push until they're burnt out. They can't do anything about it. Okay. So exit tickets. At the end of a lesson, students write down something. It gives you feedback. It informs your next lesson. And at the beginning of the next lesson, you have a talk partner. You review the previous lesson. It's a lovely way of introducing what do we know and what do we want to know. It keeps your learning live. And the big thing about this, when we talk about these ideas, is they must be dynamic. We must keep going. Okay, so is that clear to you? Red, amber, green. I hope we're getting there. And Ivan, I know I'm going to do 2 more minutes and then I'm finished. So we're very quickly, we're putting it together. So just a quick reminder, our active learning cycle. Remember that our learning is a cycle. It's dynamic. It's not static. It doesn't follow a lesson plan. Lots of support in Cambridge, but adapt it to suit your context. We even give you some lesson plan templates, which you can share with your institutions so that you get the type of planning that we want. Remember that you don't have to do everything. Be flexible, think about it. This is where the learning comes in. And just to share what I used to do, we have documents like this, a little daily lesson plan. So I make notes, and this is the way that I used to work. Even 15, 20 years ago, when I was actively teaching, I kept live. I was one of the very few people that did live document. I'd make notes about what I was teaching, and as the lesson progressed, if it changed, I would note it down. I'd keep that document alive so that it would inform me. And by the end of the week, my planner often had more red than black, where I made all those changes, and I kept a record of it because it is evidence. Okay, keep your work dated. Date your lesson plans, date your learners' exercises. On the live document, note your changes. Make sure that you are keeping them alive. Okay, don't just say, oh well, I'll remember that. You probably won't. Okay, don't try and remember everything. So remember, live planning for live learning. And above all, remember that you are teaching learners. Okay, it's not what you are teaching, it's who you are teaching. Plan for your learners. Planning for learning, plan for your learners. Thank you very much. I hope that that has been of interest to you.
Thank you so much, Simon. I think it would be great for everybody if you could show your appreciation just at this moment before we go into the Q&A, just to give Simon a round of applause in the chat box there. That would be great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you do have any questions now, feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. I think one of the questions that we saw very, very early on came from Sri Haryati, and I think there the question is about the materials for the curriculum that is set for the teachers by the school. Essentially, they're saying that you have some targets that are being imposed upon you, and your lesson plans essentially are created assuming that you can get your students to those targets. Do you have any advice for teachers that find that maybe the targets are set too high, they're too challenging?
Very often those targets are set sometimes deliberately high. And this to me is where our learning intention and particularly our success criteria come in. Often what we lack is we are given this target, but not how to achieve it. And that is where our success criteria can come in. It's breaking down the steps to reach that target. And often the reason and the big challenges that we find where we are forced into memorizing and repetition is because we haven't effectively taken those steps to reach that particular target. So then we get to there and we realize, our students haven't got there, therefore I need to go over it again and again and again, instead of planning it beforehand, step by step. If you can drive that understanding towards that target, rather than just straight on trying to hit that target, build up to it. Analogy can be what we call the spiral curriculum, which is the way that a lot of our curricula are designed, is that build a bit of knowledge, come back and revisit it, build it again, take those steps. The big challenge comes in where teachers are told, you have to hit that target now. And that is the challenge. That's where success criteria, thinking about how am I going to get there, try and build that in.
I guess somewhat related to that as well is, if you think about success criteria, you may consider, the students in your class as a whole, and you may say, okay, then I want them, or I want the majority of them to hit this particular level, or be able to do this particular, in thinking in terms of can do. I want them to be able to do something in particular.
Yep.
But if you're addressing the individual students, surely you might want to develop individual success criteria. And you mentioned it as well, knowing your learners. Is there a way that you could possibly do that? Is there any, not only in terms of the practical aspect of setting individual success criteria, but is there any advice that you also might give teachers that need to deal with their senior management team as well, but that's how they are assessing their own teaching and their own lesson plans?
Absolutely. On that, I make a very clear, and again, another analogy in thinking about doing a road journey, a journey by road, if you like. We know that whatever subject you're teaching, whether it's English, you have got to get to a particular point at the end of your journey, whether it's doing first English, whether it's doing it might be a learners, flyers, movers, etc. Wherever it is, you might be aiming to get to that point. But what you've got to understand is that children, learners, and teachers often take different ways of getting there. Some can go a dead straight road, others have got to weave. And the way that we approach this is recognizing we have to get to that target, but our learners might take different steps to get there. And therefore we need to scaffold. And I come back to this word, scaffold. And that is specific help. We can liken that perhaps to services on a highway. We need to stop, we need to refuel, we need to add in a bit, then we carry on. So we scaffold differently. And now that means giving our learners other clues around them. So for example, word lists, or we put up within the classroom, we put up displays, or we allow them, and this is a key one for language, we allow them to talk to each other. We get them to talk and chat in groups to share their learning, build that experience. They will get there. We recognize they've got to get there. It's how we get there. And it's this scaffolding, and it's recognizing that and I don't like this idea, and it's been rejected by majority of thinkers, of what we call an individual learning plan. That's not necessary, but it's recognizing that we might need to do things slightly differently, different levels of help.
We had a question also, given that we're talking about lesson planning and changing the way in which you think about planning your lessons, we do have a question whether there are any resources that you're familiar with that could help people with that, some templated lesson plans or templated plans that would help people think beyond a static lesson plan.
Absolutely, yes. There are various documents that you might go onto the web and you might look at those. You might want to see what perhaps the recommendations from certain government agencies are, but probably the best way of doing it without doing a direct sell is that this is something that we've addressed particularly carefully within Cambridge. And particularly within our education division in Cambridge, we've spent a lot of time looking at this in great detail. So have a look at the Cambridge University Press website, but if you can, more importantly, have a look at the teacher support documents that we provide, because that is where you will get all this all this assistance with the planning of dynamic, exciting lessons.
Okay, thank you very much then.
I think we probably have to do a direct plug there, but we know that this is a very different approach for many teachers, and a lot of the new resources have been based on the feedback that I've given, that I've got from teachers. So this actually is a dynamic way of working, but as an educationalist, that's it.
I'm going to ask just one final question then, which is actually almost the exact opposite of all of the other questions that we've probably seen in the Q&A box. And that is a question, in my school, there are still some teachers who don't like to to write lesson plans. And when they do, they only write the outlines. Do you have any suggestions about how to make teachers aware of the importance of writing a kind of a somewhat more detailed lesson plan? What would you say in that situation?
Okay, what I would say is that, yes, having an outline is absolutely fine, and highly experienced teachers, an outline is fine, absolutely. Way you can encourage your teachers to do that is to take it up a level. Now, the way that I talk about taking it up a level is ask them about the quality of questions they are asking in the class. So if they are using what I call fairly low order questions, or the typical closed questions that are just routine and response, ask them to start writing and planning more open questions. So higher questions that develop higher order thinking skills. So ask them to think and plan the questions that will get the learners doing more higher order thinking, open questions. So not questions like, for example, what is the noun in this sentence, but tell me how you recognize the noun in a sentence. So that is an open question. It's not a one-word answer. They have got to think. So ask the teachers to think about and write down the higher order thinking questions. Refer to Bloom's taxonomy, and it's the questions at the top of Bloom's taxonomy. That's a way of getting them to do some more detailed planning. And then they might recognize then the need for more detailed planning.
Thank you so much, Simon, for such an inspiring presentation you've given us today. I've been looking at all of the comments in the chat, and I've seen so many people talking about how much they've appreciated this. If I could ask you all just to give one final round of applause to Simon for today's session.
And yes, I did see a very quick one in the chat. Focus on HOTS questions, absolutely. And this is what it is. It's getting them, and this is where the learning comes in, the planning for learning. Don't worry about the routine of the lesson. Think about, what do I want my students to learn? How am I going to get them learning? And that is to focus on the higher order thinking questions. Planning for learning, not writing lesson plans. So my key takeaway, remember, it's not what you are teaching, who you are teaching. Plan for learning, and learning means thinking.